Great. Good morning. My name is Reagan Rush, and I'm the Chief of the Special Litigation Section here at the Civil Rights Division. On behalf of the department, I have the privilege of welcoming you to today's program commemorating 30 years of systemic police reform cases under our statute, 34 U.S.C. Section 12601. In 1994, 3 years after the nation first watched Los Angeles police officers brutally beat black motorists named Rodney King, Congress passed 12601, which gave the Department of Justice the authority to investigate and remedy patterns or practices of police misconduct. Over the last 3 decades, the division has opened more than 80 formal pattern or practice investigations, which have offered a top-to-bottom look at some of the nation's largest law enforcement agencies, including Puerto Rico, which had 17,000 sworn officers at the time of our investigation, and some of the nation's smallest law enforcement agencies, including the Lexington Police Department, with a mere 8 sworn officers. From large cities to rural communities, the department has used its authority under 12601 to ensure constitutional and fair policing. Yet we know there's still so much work to be done. We welcome all of you in the audience today, both here in person and joining online, including all of our colleagues from the Department of Justice, advocates, community members, and law enforcement partners who work every day to make our communities safer. Today, we are honored to be joined by department leadership as well as distinguished speakers who come from diverse backgrounds, including law enforcement, politics, civil rights advocacy, and academia. Our speakers will bring various perspectives to bear as we reflect on the meaning of and the unfinished work of systemic police reform under 12601. To begin today's program, we'll hear opening remarks from a leader within the Department of Justice, who, across his many leadership roles, has prioritized the enforcement of civil rights and the pursuit of equal justice. Principal Deputy Associate Attorney General Benjamin Meiser. As the third-ranking official at the Department of Justice, Mr. Meiser oversees 13 of the department's components, including all of the civil litigation and grant-making components. Just to name a few, this includes the Civil Rights Division, the Office of Justice Programs, the Community Relations Service, the Office for Access to Justice, and the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, commonly referred to as the COPS Office. Across his many leadership roles within the department, Mr. Meiser has emphasized that ensuring equal justice under the law is central to our founding charter and to the mission of every employee of the department. This belief is reflected in his steadfast support of the Civil Rights Division, including our work to ensure that law enforcement is carried out constitutionally and effectively and in coordination with the community. I'm delighted that he can be here with us today to help mark this special occasion. Please join me in welcoming Principal Deputy Associate Attorney General Benjamin Meiser to the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you, Reagan, for that very kind introduction. And I want to give a huge thanks to the Special Litigation team for your tireless work, the result of which has been to make this an anniversary that is truly something to celebrate. Your efforts and your expertise have led to safer communities improved services for people with behavioral health disabilities, greater trust between police and the communities they serve, better training and more support for police officers, and more effective policing. I want to also express my gratitude to Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark, under whose leadership the Civil Rights Division has opened Under Kristen's leadership, the Civil Rights Division has opened 12 pattern or practice cases. In 1991, the nation watched as 4 officers beat a black motorist named Rodney King. In 1992, it watched as a jury containing no black jurists or jury members acquitted the officers of assault. Hours later, in disbelief, Los Angeles erupted into violence. During 6 days of rioting, more than 60 people died, more than 2,300 people were injured, more than 7,000 fires were set, and more than 3,000 businesses were damaged. The people in the streets were outraged about much more than how the police had treated Rodney King. They understood he was not the first person to have been mistreated by police. His abuse was just the first to be captured by a bystander on home video and shared with the world. The Department of Justice prosecuted the officers who beat and failed to protect Mr. King for violating his civil rights. But at the time, we lacked a tool to allow us to address the underlying systemic causes of those violations. Mr. King's death galvanized civil rights activists, and Americans began to understand that police misconduct, while at times attributable to a few bad apples, often stemmed from or was allowed to flourish by institutional failures. The vast majority of police do their difficult and dangerous jobs with honor and integrity. But in some agencies, ineffective supervision, ambiguous guidelines, insufficient complaint investigations and follow-up, and poor data collection, among many other issues, yield a culture that permits constitutional violations to go unchecked. Such failures harm everyone, most directly community members and their families, but also hardworking officers who are unfairly tarnished by the action of others, and those officers who might have chosen a different path if only the appropriate guardrails had been provided. When Congress passed Section 12601 in 1994, it confirmed what many Americans already knew. Individual criminal prosecutions are not enough to remedy systemic police misconduct. Over the last 30 years, the department has objectively, thoroughly, and rigorously investigated more than 80 law enforcement agencies, including the Los Angeles Police Department, for patterns or practices of unlawful policing. We follow the facts where they lead, and we release reports that comprehensively describe what we find. Just shining this light on problematic practices often brings about improvements in police practices and police departments. Shortly after we launched our investigation in Trenton, New Jersey, for instance, the city disbanded 2 of the street enforcement units whose officers had committed unconstitutional stops and searches. But we do not stop at assessing problems. Our reports contain specific minimal remedial measures explaining in detail what departments must do in order to create constitutional policing. We work closely with police chiefs, mayors, community members, and other stakeholders to create a law enforcement climate that fosters trust, supports officers, and keeps people safe. LAPD, for example, dramatically improved its practices and the impact of its policing under a consent decree. Use of serious force by police decreased, serious crime decreased, community engagement and partnership increased, and accountability and supervision increased. A survey of public opinion taken near the end of the consent decree rated the police more highly and showed that more Angelenos felt respected by the police. And when we need to, as a last resort, we file lawsuits to ensure agencies make the necessary changes. Under the provisions agreed to in our settlement agreements and consent decrees, Independent monitors evaluate law enforcement agencies' implementation of reforms. My office has set forth principles for implementing these monitorships to ensure they benefit the community and law enforcement by being cost-effective, accountable, responsive to the community, efficient, and consistent in assessing compliance. Another way we help agencies implement reform is through a knowledge lab, a resource hub our Bureau of Justice Assistance maintains that identifies and publicly disseminates fair and effective policing practices, training, and technical assistance at no cost to agencies or communities. Today, we have gathered people who are closely connected with and affected by this work to discuss its impact and potential. The program ahead promises to be enlightening, enriching, and inspiring for all of us. I'm grateful to have been invited to be a part of it. I also want to take a minute to express my appreciation and gratitude for Deputy Assistant Attorney General Robert Moosey's 3 decades of service and leadership in advancing constitutional policing across the country. Early in his career, Robert worked on some of the very first Section 12601 pattern or practice investigations. And for nearly a decade, he has provided invaluable guidance, advice, and leadership, always with good cheer, while supervising the Special Litigation Section's work in this area from the Civil Rights Division's front office. I have benefited greatly from your counsel and wisdom, Robert, and so many thanks from me and everyone in this room. And now I'm going to welcome Robert to the podium for a discussion with current and past Civil Rights Division leaders. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks. To build on the reflections we just heard, I'm pleased to turn the program over to my colleague, Robert Moosey, Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division. Mr. Moosey will moderate a conversation among 2 civil rights leaders whose life's work has sought to challenge injustice and inequality. Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Kristen Clark, and former Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Tom Perez.
Can y'all hear me? Yeah, there we go. It's really a delight to be here with these 2 really amazing leaders, both of whom I've had the pleasure of working for over the course of my career. You know, each of them led the policing reform program during really critical and important moments in which I think we've seen the most progress in the program since its inception. So let's start. We only have about 20 minutes together. So yeah, I think, you know, one of the goals here is to hear from each of you about your views on the history of the program, its challenges, and some lessons learned that might inform the program going forward. So Tom, you were the Assistant Attorney General from 2009 to 2015, as I recall. Then you went on to be the Secretary of Labor. You've got a lot of experience in government reform work and in civil rights work. You were also a career prosecutor in the criminal section. What were some, you know, during your tenure as an Assistant Attorney General, what were some of the challenges facing policing profession from a civil rights perspective? And how did that impact the priorities you developed for the program?
I think you just politely said I'm the old fart here, but I'll accept that.
I'm number 2 old fart.
Knowing that there are others. It's an honor to be back here, and I'm having trouble focusing because I'm seeing so many friends that I haven't seen in a long time. You know, here's the bottom line. You know, over the course of the last 30 years, we've come an incredibly long way. And the we in this sentence isn't simply the Department of Justice. It's America. It's law enforcement. It's community leaders. It is family members of victims who want to make sure their voices are heard. It is everybody in the ecosystem coming together. 35 years ago, I started in the criminal section. I prosecuted an LAPD officer pre-Rodney King. We obtained a conviction in that case. Did we change the culture of the department? Absolutely not. I'm proud of the criminal cases we did, and at the same time, I understood that they weren't enough if our goal is to change culture and to address the underlying root causes. And when I look at where we have come, we have really learned a lot over the course of the last 30 years. I think about for instance, if you look at some of the early consent decrees, we didn't really focus on the issue of officer wellness. And one of the things we have to understand is that policing's a hard job. And officers, as well as people in the community, feel that trauma. And so you see the evolution of those consent decrees. I think about the collection of data. Seattle comes to mind. When we first investigated that case, and I think Jonathan Smith is here, and Tim and others who were involved, Seattle had a very, very high percentage of their uses of force were committed by a very, very few number of people. But they didn't track that data. So they didn't know that. You don't know what you don't know. And so now a staple of every agreement and every collaboration is that critically important data collection. Another thing that we've learned over the course of these 30 years is that we need help. And it shouldn't and can't be simply the Civil Rights Division. So, when I was AAG, we actually more broadly in the Civil Rights Program, we worked together with our U.S. Attorney's offices to establish civil rights units, which, among other things, were tackling these police cases. And, we did the Newark Police Department together with Paul Fishman and others. And that was critically important to have those local partners. I see my good friend Keith Ellison here. We should be expanding to make sure we're involving and working with our state attorneys general, because there's a lot of work to be done. And when we do it that way, I think we can build ourselves the sustainability that is so critically important. But boy, I hope we reflect on how far we have come, because I remember those first decrees and how we went about them. I see what you're doing now. And, the reality is we have to remember, we live in a world of false choices. This is not about whether we keep our communities safe or we have constitutional policing. If there's one thing that this enforcement program has been able to prove, is that that is a false choice, and that constitutional policing and reductions in crime go hand in hand. We've seen it in LA, we've seen it in Detroit, we've seen it in Seattle, and we see it everywhere.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Tom. And Kristen, same question to you. You have been a civil rights advocate for your whole career. You started here in the division, you worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, you worked for the New York Attorney General's office, leading that civil rights office, you were at the Lawyers Committee as a leader, and now since 2021, you've been our Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. So you joined a leadership role here at a really unique time. Tell us a little bit about the challenges you saw when you came here and how that informed your priorities.
Yeah. First, it is great to be here. I want to thank all of the advocates and the lawyers and the judges and prosecutors who've assembled here today so that we have this opportunity to reflect on the tremendous work that we've done over the past 30 decades to promote constitutional policing, but to really focus on the road ahead, the important work that we've got to keep pressing forward in what I deem to be just about some of the hardest work that we do here at the department. I stepped into this role on the heels of the tragic deaths of Breonna Taylor, and thank you, Ms. Palmer, for being here, and George Floyd, and so many others, right? Deaths that galvanized the nation, galvanized the world, right? We saw demonstrations and protests in every corner of the country and a rallying cry for racial justice and constitutional policing. So I stepped into this role realizing that we needed to continue to put our foot on the gas and figuring out, how can we achieve the goal of making sure that police officers are able to do their job, keep us safe, without it coming at the cost, the price point of human lives, And we've done that in a couple of ways. Dedicated prosecutors in the Civil Rights Division continue to diligently prosecute and hold individual officers accountable when they violate people's civil and constitutional rights. And all across the country, we have been working to do just that. Hard work. These cases are not easy. We encounter roadblocks at every turn, but I'm really pleased with the track record that we've developed when it comes to accountability. But the systemic reform really gives us a chance to scale up this work that we need to do to make sure that law enforcement officers serving in the thousands of agencies that stretch across the country are doing right by the public. Are not singling out people based on their race or their disability status. This work, I think, is also just about the most resource-intensive and time-intensive work that we do in the division. When I stepped in, we mentioned the 12 pattern and practice investigations that we opened. Even more important are the 12 consent decrees and settlements that we inherited, where we have the obligation to move to the finish line. And I'm pleased today that we're going to be able to talk about the success that consent decrees have in really changing and transforming the way that policing looks in communities. Albuquerque, Seattle, New Mexico, Baltimore, New Orleans. These are places where, we are seeing reductions in use of force, where we are seeing reductions in the number of wrongful death lawsuits. It's hard work, really requires that you sustain the trust of communities. That is so key. It does not work when you've got just police officials and the department and the courts focusing on this business. The community is key and the center point, and I think that's something we've really tried to focus on. How do we keep communities focused on this work? Because when the department is gone, they're the ones that can help ensure that officials stay on course.
Kristen, when I think of one of your many legacies in this program is your focus on working with the community and going to communities that we haven't gone to before and really trying to engage the full set of stakeholders in this police reform effort. Not just, when I started this work, it was just a bunch of lawyers in a Civil Rights Division office, no U.S. attorneys, no community, doing our best looking at, prior police reform efforts. I think now there's so much of a greater role in the police officer community, the community in the city, the civil rights community. Can you comment a little bit on kind of things you've done to have the community have a greater role in this work?
I always say that we do our best work when we are outside this building. And when we are on the road and in community, and we have tried our darndest to do just that, to get on the road to communities in the Deep South and other underserved areas where you don't have well-organized organizations and press focused on the issues. So Lexington, Mississippi is an example of this. Very poor, rural, majority Black community in Mississippi, and we convened a public town hall. We wanted to hear from the community, hear about the issues that were top of mind for them, educate them about the work that we do in the division. And there was one singular issue that rose to the fore: the terror that was gripping this community at the hands of their small police department. that imposed fines and fees at every turn, that incarcerated people without a lawful basis, where court meets for once or twice a month, and so people languish in jail. Really horrific conditions. I'm very proud of the work that our Special Litigation Section team has done. First and foremost, garnering the trust of this community that had lots of reasons not to trust the government, so garnering trust, and then going into this police department, figuring out all the things that were broken. We've now put forth a public findings report and are working with officials to figure out how we can get this community back on track. And I think that work is important. We've got a fair number of large cities that we have focused on in the course of doing this work, but these small police departments in rural areas are just as important, and it's important that they not escape accountability.
I mean, I don't know that we would have ever even heard about the problems in the Lexington Police Department if you hadn't gone out with others in the division and sort of went to communities that don't have big newspapers, don't have big civil rights organizations defending them, and just listened. And I'm so proud of the work that we did there.
I appreciate it.
Great.
But thank you. No big organizations, but I'd be remiss if I didn't call out some of the fearless and courageous advocates on the ground there. Folks like Jill Jefferson, an advocate who was locked up by the police while filming and recording misconduct. So I just want to call out the courage of folks on the ground in some of these areas.
Tom, same question to you. I mean, you came to a program that was pretty much inwardly focused just on the Civil Rights Division. You alluded to this a little bit about how you broadened the scope of the program to engage with various communities that have meaningful input into it. Can you just build on that a little bit?
Well, this focus was not simply in the police work. One of the things we focused on from the outset was, if we build 93 beachheads across America, civil rights units in U.S. attorneys' offices, people who have victim witness coordinators who are out there in the community day in and day out, because what you just described that you did is absolutely heroic and critical. Imagine if we've got that, 90-fold across the country. And that's what we were able to do when we do this together. And part of this session today is to reflect not only on what we've done, but where we need to go. And that's why I keep coming back to the issue of expanding capacity, because the more stakeholders we have involved in this line of work, the more justice we will be able to bring about. And another thing that's really important, you mentioned trust a number of times, and trust has many dimensions. The most important tool that an officer has in their arsenal is the trust of the community. If you don't have the trust, you don't have anything. Joe Arpaio was a disgrace to law enforcement, and the distrust that his lack of leadership fostered created so much trouble, and crime went up, it didn't go down, because of his silliness. And so a big part of what we do is we're building that trust. And one of the things, and part of that trust building is building trust with law enforcement, because we have to be honest, we've often had an adversarial relationship going in. And there are others, I'm thinking about Portland, for instance. Portland was a wonderful example. They had something like 7 or 8 uses of deadly force on people who were in serious mental health crisis in a 14-month period. And the police chief and the mayor said, "We have a problem. We are going to help you. We want you to help us. We're going to do this together." And the reason I bring up Portland as an example is because forward-looking police chiefs understand that when we work together, we can often solve the underlying challenges. And the underlying challenge in Portland was the absence of a community mental health infrastructure. And our settlement helped bring about a massive infusion of resources so that you could have ACT teams, assertive community treatment teams. You could have a community mental health infrastructure. It wasn't the choice between the ER or the county jail. for police officers, and they were trained in how to interact with people who are in mental health crisis. So, we've learned a lot of lessons, and one of the lessons, which is critical, is working together with law enforcement leadership. And people like Tom Manger and Kathy O'Toole and others who've set a remarkable tone in their departments. That is why I have great hope that we can continue this work. But we've got to make sure we have more people engaged. And I keep looking at you, Keith, because I'm so glad that you are here today, and I am so appreciative of the work you have done on bringing justice to Minnesota.
So we have just a few minutes left, but Kristen, I think one of the things that, following up on Tom's point, that I think under your leadership we've really done is tried to build that capacity in the division, in the stakeholder groups, civil rights groups, but also with the state attorney generals. Kind of picking up on Tom's point about lessons learned and what we might say to the folks in the audience about the lessons that you've learned as a leader in this program, what would you say to the folks out there going forward? What are some lessons learned that we need to keep in our hearts as we continue this program?
Yeah, that it's going to take all of us. We've worked very hard to activate all 90+ U.S. attorneys' offices across the country to be partners in this work. We've conducted trainings for state AG offices who post George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, where we saw states adopting new laws that conferred enforcement authority at the state level to conduct pattern and practice investigations. And we want that, we encourage that, we need that. We know that the Justice Department cannot, has not, and will not ever do all of this work on its own. The nonprofit organizations and the law school clinics, the judges that have decrees in front of them, the independent monitors that are enlisted to do this work, the experts, the statisticians, and the policing experts that we bring in all play a critical role in this work, and then of course the community. But it's going to take all of us. This work, there's nothing political about this work. I always say this work is life and death. People often ask me, what's the stuff that keeps you up at night? And it's this, right? Because we have lost too many lives to the malice and callousness that we unfortunately see at the hands of police officers. And we can and we must do better. American democracy will thrive and can thrive when we have fair, transparent, non-discriminatory policing in our country. It's something we've got to continue fighting for.
Two very brief points. Number one, let me just address an elephant in the room, which is there are some who believe that this work ties the hands of law enforcement. And what you have seen, everyone in this room, through the work you have done, is it does exactly the opposite. By bringing people together, by addressing culture issues, by making sure that we're taking the necessary steps, we can reduce crime, enhance respect for law enforcement, bring about all the win-win-win solutions. And one thing I encourage folks to do, people in academia and elsewhere, is we need to do a better job of making the case for that. Chris Stone and others at Harvard did a very, very soup-to-nuts review of the LAPD decree. We saw that it helped enhance public confidence in law enforcement, reduce crime. There was not the phenomenon of depolicing where officers are sitting in their vehicle because they're afraid to interact. That was a myth. It didn't happen. And the challenge that I think we have, if we want to sustain this program, is we need to demonstrate through objective, thorough analysis that these investments, just as the LAPD investments, improved metrics on every level, are doing that same thing. So if you're looking for something to do after today, make sure we make the case, because I am confident in Seattle, in Portland, and in so many other places, New Orleans and Maricopa County, elsewhere, our work worked. But we've got to make that case, because there are some who are trying to use the world of false choices to move it backward, and that would be bad for democracy.
Well, we are at time. It has been a pleasure being up here with both of you. I look forward to being in community with you and with the others in this room as we go forward in this important work. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Musi, Assistant Attorney General Clark, and Assistant Attorney General Perez, for your thoughtful perspectives and your lifelong work toward civil rights. Now we turn to our next panel, a conversation with Assistant Attorney General Clark and Ms. Tamika Palmer, the mother of Breonna Taylor.
We are so honored to have Tamika Palmer with us today. She is my shero. Ms. Palmer is a leading voice in the national fight for justice for her daughter and for victims of gun and police violence everywhere. She grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and at 15 began a series of commitments to caring for others. First as a babysitter, then as a nurse's aide, and in 1993, when Breonna was born, a mother, perhaps her most important role.
Yes.
Breonna was a 26-year-old emergency medical technician. She was asleep in her bed when two Louisville Metropolitan Police officers banged on the door at about 12:40 a.m. on March 13th of 2020. The noise woke her up and her boyfriend, Kenny. They stepped into the hallway of her two-bedroom apartment just moments before officers broke down the front door. Kenny had grabbed his handgun because he and Breonna thought an intruder was breaking in. When police breached the door, Kenny immediately fired, and two officers quickly returned, fired 22 times, hitting Breonna. Meanwhile, another officer ran around to the side of the apartment and fired 10 shots blindly through covered windows, narrowly missing Breonna, who died shortly thereafter, and sending shots through the walls into the neighboring apartment. The entire raid was based on a false warrant. I will say the obvious: Breonna should be alive today. And so, Ms. Palmer, we are just so honored that you came from across the country. You flew in from Hawaii and landed just a few hours ago to be with us, and you're still standing.
Yes.
So many of us have heard the gut-wrenching story of Breonna Taylor, and I think it's important that we recount it so that we never forget, and so that we are reminded about why this work of policing reform is so urgent. Her tragic death literally inspired a global movement calling for racial justice and for police accountability. But today we want to focus on her. And so I want to ask you to maybe tell our audience a little bit about Breonna. What was she like, and maybe what didn't she like, and who did she hope to become?
She was 26, we all know. Breonna loved the world. She loved to help people. She loved to sing. She wasn't good at it, but she would do it anyways. and she would do it loudly and anywhere. She loved life. She loved her family. She loved being around family. She didn't get that from me either because, people. But she was just living life. She loved it. She was living it. She wanted to become a NICU nurse. She had started with being an EMT. She moved over to 2 different hospitals working in the emergency room. She just was on her way. She was creating a path for herself, and she was determined, and she deserved to do that.
Her tragic death and the tragic killings of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd sparked protests and outrage everywhere. Former Louisville officer Kelly Goodlett has pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy charges that we brought. Former officer Brett Hankinson was convicted just a few weeks ago for violating Breonna's rights. What have the last 4 years for you, what have they been like since her death? What moments stand out in your mind?
Hard. Hard. I've never imagined one day without Breonna. So, almost 5 years, and I don't still understand why she's not here. I know what happened. It still doesn't make sense to me. She didn't deserve this. No one does, for that matter. It's hard to continue to watch people die at the hands of the police. And I'm grateful for convictions, but people are still dying. And so it's hard. It's hard.
I don't know how you do it, but you continue to find the strength and courage to fight for change. And I'm wondering, where do you draw inspiration from?
The community, just my family, having good friends and family and community, and just the people I've met along the way, people who truly took the time to listen, like you are, just people, because for so long no one was listening, no one, I don't even know how to explain that feeling, but then we watched George Floyd die on camera, and so people finally started to listen about Breonna, and it truly made a difference in my life, because in the beginning I just felt like no one cared. Like, Breonna was such an amazing person, and she died, and no one was listening.
People have been listening in large part because you have not given up hope and have been pushing for justice. You talked about the community being a source of inspiration, and I can recall being in Louisville for a community meeting when we released the findings from our investigation into the Louisville Police Department, and the room was incredibly diverse. White, black, young, old, veterans, mothers, and they all stood up for you and gave you a rousing applause. But it's just been amazing to see the way in which you have galvanized communities everywhere. I want to talk a little bit about the changes that you would like to see in policing.
It's a lot. I think that I think police, if they were to live in these neighborhoods that they're policing, or at least the very least, get out of the car and interact with the people in those neighborhoods, they can close that gap where we're not trusting the police and we're not wanting to deal with them because of how we're treated. I think that if they got to know the people in those neighborhoods, they wouldn't feel the need to over-police those neighborhoods. I think that we have to be more swift in some of these convictions. No family should have to wait over 5 years to hope for any sort of justice. And it's not that we don't want the police around, we don't know how to trust the police, and they're not helping us. So I think that, and at the same time, the people in the community have to be open to learning to trust the police again. And I've never not thought that there was no need for police, but I definitely think that they can do a better job.
Residency requirements, restoring trust, accountability, all themes that we're going to talk about during the second half of the program today. What can we do to better support families that are grieving?
Stop victim blaming. I think a lot of times police put out these false narratives to cover their own tracks, and it's not true. And there's people who will always choose to believe the police no matter what is said, and it doesn't make sense because I remember every story ever came out about Breonna not being true. And the hardest thing was to listen to it, to not respond, to not fight every single person who ever made a false story about Breonna. I think that people need to understand that this is hard for us. And when this happens, our lives are completely turned upside down as well. I mean, literally upside down. If I ate a piece of bubble gum in the store when I was 5, it was talked about. It was insane. It has nothing to do with anything. I think people need to be patient and let the facts come out and be willing to listen and accept the truth.
What do you want people to remember about Breonna?
That she could light up a room, that she was, she would bend over backwards for anybody. She wanted to have a family. She wanted to just live, and she deserved to do that. And I want people to know that if it was anybody else, she'd be out here fighting just as hard for you as people have fought for her.
And I guess my last question for you is what does justice look like for you? What does justice mean to you?
Convictions and upholding those convictions. That's the hardest part. So many times we watch so many other things happen. So I pray that we are still on the right path to justice. I pray that it continues to come and that people continue to do the right thing. I pray that we stop dying by the hands of the police. Yeah.
We could not have an honest conversation today without centering your voice and your advocacy. So I want to thank you for being with us today. Our condolences go out to you every moment. We will never forget Breonna Taylor. We will never stop fighting for justice for Breonna Taylor. And the reason why we do this 12601 reform work is because there shouldn't be another Breonna Taylor
Absolutely.
in the future. So thank you, please.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Ms. Palmer, for sharing both you and Brianna's story. It's stories like Brianna's that remind us why we must continue to fight every day for a more just world. It was an honor to hear from you today. Thank you. Our next panel will consider a jurisdiction that has invested the time, resources, and efforts required to transform a city's approach to public safety, the City of Seattle. We'll hear from key players that have been vital to the city's success over the last decade. To moderate this panel, I'm privileged to invite my colleague, Special Counsel with the Office of Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Tim Maguette.
Thank you, Reagan. Thank you, Reagan, and thank you all for being here today. I'm joined here by three people I've worked closely with on the US v. Seattle case over many years, and so I'm privileged to call them friends as well as colleagues in this work. First is Kathy O'Toole. She's the first female commissioner of the Boston Police Department, also the first chief inspector of the Garda Inspectorate in Ireland. But perhaps most relevant here, Kathy served as chief of the Seattle Police Department from 2014 to 2018 and was a key leader in implementing the Seattle Consent Decree. I'm also joined by Antonio Oftali. He's the Executive Director of Leadership for a Networked World and a Fellow at the Technology and Entrepreneurship Center at Harvard University. He's also a past commissioner on the Commission on the Future of Policing in Ireland, and he is currently the monitor of the Seattle Police Department Consent Decree, serving there since the fall of 2020. And finally, Mike Diaz is currently a judge on the Washington Court of Appeals, where he was appointed in 2022. Prior to that, he served for 5 years as a judge in the King County Superior Court. But most relevant here, Mike spent 10 years as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Western District of Washington, where he was intimately involved in the investigation that led to the Seattle Police Consent Decree, as well as the implementation of the consent decree itself. So my first question is for you. You were involved, as I just said, from the very beginning here. Can you give us a little context? What did DOJ find during its investigation of the Seattle Police Department?
Well, Tim, first of all, just thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. It's a tremendous honor to join you all, join this amazing panel for this such an important topic and celebration. So, it's 2010. There had just been the killing in broad daylight of a Native American woodcarver named John T. Williams, which just horrified the city, prompting our investigation. And by our investigation, I mean a joint investigation, a truly joint investigation between the Special Litigation Section and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Washington. And I mean truly, because we were hand in glove with Jonathan Smith, with Tim Maguette, with then AG Tom Perez, and my boss, the U.S. Attorney Jenny Durkin, who became mayor of Seattle eventually. Anyways, we conducted a 9-month investigation, looked at about 2 terabytes of data, hundreds of hours of videos, and ultimately concluded that, in fact, the Seattle Police Department had engaged in a pattern of practice of excessive force, but we did not make such a finding that they engaged in discriminatory policing. And so a lot of this related to failures of some of the things you've heard today already: failures in policy, failures in training, and particularly failures in supervision. Working backwards from those, we looked at a random set of 1,200 use of force events, and in those 1,200 use of force events, over a period of around 2 years, the supervisors only sent back for any further review about 5 use of force events. There also hadn't been training that required by state law in approximately 6 years, and there had been no guidance on how and when to use force, and particularly how to report force, so that the supervisors could provide the guidance that they needed to provide to their employees. And so the department was failing organizationally, not just victims such as John T. Williams, but their own officers, like the third-year officer Ian Burke, who shot John T. Williams that day and had received no training on force on any level, let alone how to engage with that community. So.
Thanks, Mike. Can you talk a little bit about, when we entered the consent decree, what were some of the major obstacles to reform that we hit early on, both within the police department and in the city?
So I talked a little bit about the organizational failures, but really it was more than that. I mean, there was a calcified leadership at the Seattle Police Department at the time. Some of the leadership had been with the department for decades, had done it a certain way, and couldn't see any other way of doing it, and became very defensive when we raised issues from the very beginning. There was also a mayor who was inexperienced in policing and really deferring to the police department in a way that was an abdication of his duties. And third, there was a culture in the department generally of command and control. We had leadership within the union who said, just listen to us and we won't have problems when the community raised these concerns. And finally, there was just, and this was probably the largest challenge for us, there was a disconnect between broad swaths of the communities, of the various diverse communities of Seattle, the immigrant communities, the communities of color, all sorts of communities, and their own police department.
Can you talk a little bit more about the community then, Mike? How did the community feel about our investigation and about the consent decree itself? What did it mean for them?
Well, in Seattle, we were lucky enough to have a pretty well-organized community, sophisticated. There was a group of about 34 of them that requested in writing, led by then the ACLU, but it certainly wasn't just limited to the ACLU, for us to come in and conduct an investigation. I think one of the keys to the success, the initial success of our process, was to engage with those community groups fully on their terms, in their locations, in their languages, and just listen multiple times, take notes, and ultimately hear what they are saying, what they think are the challenges of this police department. Ultimately, we met with them multiple times during our preliminary review, during the investigation, and then later, as we were announcing the investigation. There came a transition where it becomes a consent decree, it's judge-led, and there might be changes. There are challenges. It's not all kumbaya, but it was definitely a foundation we built for the next steps.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for setting that stage for us a little bit. So then, Kathy, 2014, almost 2 years after the consent decree is entered, you become the Seattle Police Chief. What shape was Seattle Police Department in when you first became chief, and what were your priorities? How did you seek to go about your new role?
Thanks, Tim, and please allow me to say thank you to you as well for your friendship. I know I had you on speed dial throughout the process, and thanks for inviting me here today. It's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues who share our passion for constitutional policing and community safety. When I arrived, it was much like Mike described. There was a real sense of defensiveness. There was still a lot of angst, on the heels of the investigation. There didn't seem like a real commitment to moving the organization forward. But again, there was a new mayor in town who committed to moving forward. As Mike said, the U.S. attorney at that time was very committed to the process. I was the new kid in town, and I made it very clear right away that the train had left the station. No point in looking back. I always said, the train or the track. Let's just keep moving forward. And I think, for the most part, especially the officers in the organization appreciated that. I think they were calling out for leadership. And when I say leadership, I don't mean just my leadership. I was able to put together an extraordinary leadership team in Seattle. People who just brought really great ideas, great passion to the work. One of them, Chris Fisher, is here today. But I established a team of sworn and non-sworn professionals who, among us we had JDs and PhDs, we had an engineer, and we had some incredibly committed career police leaders who were very experienced and principled. And together, I mean, we really were a cohesive team. The leadership in Seattle gave me the opportunity to put together this team, which was a real opportunity to establish momentum. And we spent every day and every night out of the office in the community, listening carefully to community perspectives, listening carefully to the voices of police officers who are out there working in the community, and trying to be as transparent as possible. On a day-to-day basis, but listening. It's all about relationships at the end of the day, internally in the organization, with all of the parties, with your team, with the U.S. Attorney's Office. We had a great relationship with the judge. Again, it was communication, authentic relationships that I really think made a difference.
Thanks, Kathy. So Seattle made a lot of progress under the consent decree when you were chief there. What were some of the key drivers from your perspective to getting the consent decree implemented? How did you push that forward?
Well, I think, Mike already alluded to it. Sadly, I think we've done a horrible job in this country, not just in Seattle, but in this country, investing in training for our officers. So we hadn't given them the appropriate policies. We hadn't given them robust training. We invested in recruit training, but very little in-service training. So it really forced the city, when they signed the agreement, to invest in the police department. So in addition to working with your teams to put together modern policies, policies are useless unless the officers get the appropriate training so that they can practice according to those policies. So we did a lot of work on scenario training. I went to every single training class, put on the BDUs like everyone else, because I wanted to see what the officers were getting. And I think the officers really appreciated that, and they appreciated the training they were getting. In addition, the city invested in modern uniforms, in new cars, in extraordinary technology, which Tom mentioned earlier, was enabled us to capture timely and accurate data to inform our work, but also to share that data transparently with the community so they knew what we were doing.
What did the consent decree achieve during your tenure as chief? What did you see as the key achievements?
Well, first and foremost, we established much better relationships with the community. Community trust rose significantly in independent studies, independent surveys conducted by the monitoring team and by the University of Seattle University. We were able to demonstrate that community trust rose significantly in all neighborhoods across the city. We were also able to drive crime down. We had an extraordinary clearance rate because we were communicating more effectively and people were willing to engage with us more effectively. So, I mean, again, across the board, and I have to say that the police officers, really bought into the training, bought into the new policies. And look, if people did something inappropriate, we held them accountable. But I think we did it. We were fair, and inevitably, I think most of the officers, felt that we had gained from the consent decree. They were better equipped, they were better trained, and they had better relationships with the community.
So, last question for you, Kathy. Not everything goes perfectly under a consent decree. It doesn't fix every problem. What were some of the challenges you saw in the process? What did you see as, just some things that made it difficult?
Well, I think, when we enter into these agreements, we create expectations, what's the adage? Perfection is the enemy of the good. Unfortunately, policing is a very complicated and sometimes messy business. Police officers are human beings making split-second decisions under very difficult circumstances, but we need to hold them accountable for acting according to their training, acting according to the law, the Constitution. So I think that it was, there were challenges along the way, but I think that the community expectations when we did have a shooting, if we did have a tragedy, again, I think because we had established trust and legitimacy with the community, we were able to address some of those challenges head on. If we had a tragedy, again, we had the faith-based community, we had community advocates on speed dial, and we would just share information. We'd be truthful. We'd stand up, share information, and take responsibility. And but it's a challenge. I think that's the biggest challenge, that we implement these agreements and people expect perfection, and sadly, we're going to have tragedies from time to time. Hopefully, we've reduced them significantly, but when we do have them, we need to take responsibility. We need to continue to communicate and be transparent with our communities.
So by the time Kathy left, when you left in 2018, Seattle had achieved initial compliance with the entire consent decree. 2 years later, almost 2 years later, Antonio Oftali comes in as the second monitor of the consent decree. Things were not quite the same in the fall of 2020 when you joined. So what was the status of the consent decree implementation when you joined the case, Antonio, in the fall of 2020? And what were some of the challenges that the police department was facing at that time?
Yeah, first, thanks, Tim, for inviting me to this event, and thank you to all of you here in attendance. I think one thing that's crystal clear is we cannot stop doing this work. We need to keep moving forward in this. We cannot walk it backwards. So no matter what happens over the next 4 years or so, we need to take the lessons learned and keep applying them and pushing on them. And secondly, importantly, thank you, Tamika Palmer, for being here. Thank you for making me cry. I think it was a good reminder of the importance of this work, and God bless you and everything you're working for. Tamika reminded me, I think, of the importance of this work in a way that was brought to me and from the heart, right? I grew up in Minneapolis, Lake and 28th, 3rd Precinct headquarters, which was burned down during 2020. Been actively involved with the city and helping them rebuild. And when I was brought into Seattle, it was somewhat on the heels of all of that. And so I came into it with a sense of, we have to start doing things in different ways. Seattle was in substantial compliance going into 2020. There was great work that was put in place by not only Chief O'Toole, but by the rank and file officers and the city, and making sure policies and practices and supervision were very sound, and the accountability system was strong, as well as data and transparency. So it was a really good point. But there had been about a year and a half or so of lapse in just overall monitoring of some of the community engagement. There were some issues that had been happening in the city. So when the 2020 social justice movement happened, Seattle in some ways was facing a pressure test, in that everything held steady when it came to general use of force and crisis intervention and whatnot. But there were some missteps and some challenges that came from the response of the Seattle Police Department during those protests, which then provoked kind of a massive lack of trust from community during that point in time. And so we were at definitely somewhat of a low. And I think one of the key points to remember during this, and for all consent decrees, is there's this temporal piece to it. They don't all go in a linear fashion, right? You start it and then you finish it and then everything's wonderful. There tends to be some ebbs and flows. I think most of these will fall into about 3 different time horizons. So that first time horizon under Kathy, everything went really well, a lot of great work. There was a little bit of a lull, and now we're at the point now where we're trying to finish things out. So 2020 came in, and we had to restart a lot of the community collaboration, some of the connective tissue between the monitoring team, DOJ, the city, and again, community, as well as start to go back to say, what do we have to do to have a solid base to move forward? And so we embarked on a series of studies to just measure what was happening in the city and do assessments to more or less get to where we are now.
Yeah, so what is the status of the consent decree now, and what has been key to getting the city to this point?
So the status is, I'm happy to say right now that we're at very near closure for the Seattle consent decree. Knock a little bit on wood. I think by the turn of next year into the first quarter or so, we'll be able to have a hearing on termination and closing this successfully. Where we got from that was coming off the base of what Kathy had talked about and Mike Perez, the ability to make sure that the policies and practices, number one, were sound, and that there's training around those policies and practices. You combine that with a really rigorous accountability system. In Seattle, there's a triad accountability system of the community and an Office of Investigation, the Office of Inspector General, and the Office of Police Accountability to investigate police disciplinary matters, and so making sure that accountability system was really strong and robust. And then I think exceptionally important was Seattle and was transparency in data and measures and analytics. I can pretty confidently say that Seattle's probably one of the top 3 policing organizations in the world when it comes to transparency of how operations go day to day, the use of force, what's happening in communities, the trends, et cetera, that are all on a dashboard for community to engage with and see. So that solid base of, again, policy and practice, accountability, data and transparency, and a real strong connection to community brought us to where we are now. And I have to say as well that the rank and file officers who really engaged in this work over the past few years through 2020 and into today to really say, how do we make this change real and live it out day to day and make sure that we're doing this with community was key to all this.
So Antonio, last question for you, and then some quick questions for everybody. From your perspective, what has the consent decree achieved? What are its best outcomes, and what are some of its limitations?
Yeah, I think in Seattle, it's achieved this base. We have this base now of constitutional and lawful policing that's continuous and how I view as sustainable. But more importantly, on top of that, is this ethos, strategic view, the innovation, however you want to say it, of making sure that policing gets better and better over time. So Seattle's been able to take that base of constitutional lawful policing and build on that. So now they're agile. They're what I would call a learning organization, so they actively think about what they're doing in the field. They work with community on that to say, what can we do better? They have force review boards and force review units and the Office of Inspector General that systemically look at patterns of how officers are working in the field, look at incidents and say, what can we do better day in, day out? And then communicating those results and that policy change. So they've developed this kind of a learning cycle, so to say, of strong accountability from the ground up to a point where they can innovate and transform continuously, and I think continuously adapt and respond to what community wants in real time.
So that learning organization is really important and something we are trying to achieve throughout all of our consent decrees. And I just want to give a few stats here from Seattle. That learning organization actually really achieved some significant things. When we opened, as Mike said at the very beginning, the concentration was really on a pattern or practice of the use of excessive force. And one of the things by the end here, we really saw overall use of force declining 48%. Most serious use of force declined by 60%. Average monthly taser usage declined by 80%. Like, we really saw significant reductions in the way that force was used. And really, hopefully, really achieving exactly those goals to protect the people in the community and to create that bond between the community and the police department where they are trusting each other and are effective in that crime fight together again. So, a couple of lightning round questions for you guys. What's one key lesson each of you learned from the Seattle consent decree experience? Kathy.
Well, it just underscored, my belief that it's all about relationships at the end of the day. Relationships with the community, relationships with the officers and their representative associations, and relationships among all the parties that contributed to this work.
Antonio.
Yeah, I think we can impact culture, and this is something that's been a challenge for all of us, thinking about what can we do around policing culture. When you combine the operational capabilities around that policy and practice and then you really foster the cultural competencies, we can get to something good. I just have to say, Tim, the stats were spot on. SPD's overall use of force declined 33% from 25 to 2019 and 49% from 2015 to 2023. One of the most critical things with that, though, is type 2 force, where there's often more officer discretion. They have to think a little bit about things. They can make some judgment calls. That's dropped dramatically, which shows that there's a culture in Seattle, in the policing organization, of affirmation of life and due process, of thinking about what does it mean to actually not harm someone, not just protect, but not harm. So that cultural attributes that's been manifested in Seattle, I think, shows that you can, through a consent decree, work on all the policy and practice to get to actual true cultural change.
What about you, Mike?
I'd say two things. The first, and especially for people who are going to do this work in the future, that reform is 1 part investigation, negotiations, 9 part enforcement or implementation. In other words, the investigation negotiation is very interesting, very splashy, right? Gets a lot of news. The hard part of reform that takes the years and years, that's when you have to flood the zone with resources and stick with it. And I don't just mean the cops in the cities, but the community groups, to demand that they come in and provide some of the training, provide the oversight, spend their hours to engage with the police. So, and the second part is just to not dodge the issues that you know are out there. We had really complicated union issues. We had really complicated mass demonstration issues that we kind of ducked a little bit in 2010. They came back, and Antonio is working on now because we didn't fully address them. So it's all of the above sometimes, unfortunately.
All right, last question for each of you. What are you most proud of from this experience?
The fact that the Seattle Police Department now enjoys a much higher level of community trust. And I thank the officers for that.
There's a ripple effect to this work for all of us across the nation, and I think we all need to be proud of that. Seattle shows that consent decrees can work, and what happens there in the learning ripples out across all sorts of police departments across the nation that maybe don't have, of course, a consent decree in place or someone working on that, but they can learn from what happens in these cities, and I think all of us should be very proud of that. When
we started the investigation, we learned that 70% of the force was being used against folks who are in behavioral health crisis. 70%. By the time I left in 2018, it had dropped to 15%. So the thing I'm most proud of the thing I'm most proud of was the work on crisis intervention and really focusing on what in my faith tradition is called the least among us, right? Those people in those dark corners who need help and the officers who need guidance to help them. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you to our panelists and for sharing your experiences and your steadfast commitment to working on these issues. I now have the privilege of inviting Paul Killebrew, Deputy Chief in the Special Litigation Section, to the stage for our final panel focused on the future of police reform work.
Okay, there we go. Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad you're all here. We've got an amazing group of leaders here for this last panel to talk about the future of this pattern or practice program. I'm going to introduce everybody as we go instead of all up front. Is that all right? Yeah. All right, wonderful. So we're here to talk about the future of this program. As you've heard already, it's been going for about 30 years. And so we've done some real learning, and we've got some things to think about for the future. And I'm going to begin with a question about what are we doing that is working that we need to continue doing? So y'all are all familiar with our program in different ways, which I'll reveal to all of you soon. But I'm going to start with Tahir Duckett. Tahir is the executive director of the Center for Innovations and Community Safety at Georgetown University Law Center. Now that is a really cool job. The Center for Innovations and Community Safety, I think, is such an important place to observe the work that we do in this pattern or practice program, because you all work with police officers, you work with community stakeholders, you work with researchers and academics, you work with people who are trying different things to protect community safety. And so when we think about where the innovations are going to come from in this world that we're working in, it's really going to come from folks like you. And so I wanted to ask you that question. What do you think? What are we doing in this program that's working that we should continue doing?
Sure. So I want to start, I guess, by saying thank you for having us here. And I think part of the importance of the work is reflecting, right? And taking the time to actually think about what's working and what's not working and where we should move forward, because too often it does feel like a lot of this work ends up being reactive. In particular moments, there's a crisis, now we have to move. So these moments that we actually take to sit and reflect on what have we actually been doing over the past 30 years, that's, I think, an important part of the process. I also think it's important to continue the work. DOJ rarely uncovers anything that the residents in a community don't already know about their law enforcement agency. But that doesn't mean that the investigations and the reports and the consent decrees aren't still critical, because they can provide backing for reformers, for advocates within their cities. They can provide validation that is really critical as these folks who are tired, right? They have been doing this work oftentimes. When DOJ shows up, the folks that are in these cities, they have been doing this work for decades and decades and decades, and oftentimes with not a whole lot to show for it. And so a lot of what DOJ can provide is a real shot in the arm for folks to keep that work really going. And of course, that's going to be critical for when DOJ is gone, right? Because these aren't designed to last forever. And so we need to make sure that that community engagement, that kind of work that is going to make the effect of the consent decree lasting long after DOJ is gone, the folks who are going to hold the police department accountable after DOJ has left, that is the heart of a lot of the work. I think it's also really important for DOJ to continue to think broadly about the various ways in which law enforcement agencies can engage in conduct that ends up violating the law. Use of force ends up attracting a lot of attention, and rightly so. There is a special bond that is broken. There's a special, there is a tie in the fabric of a community that happens when an officer uses force against somebody without good reason. But there are also the everyday harms of legal violations, the warrantless stops and searches in Trenton, the insufficient and inadequate food in the Fulton County Jail, discrimination against Native populations, and suppression of protected speech in both Phoenix and Minneapolis, and of course, as we'll talk about a little bit later, findings that cities violate the Americans with Disabilities Act when they choose to respond to mental health crises with law enforcement rather than care. These are all elements of DOJ's work that don't always get as much attention, but they are critical not just to building law enforcement agencies that comply with the law, but also in terms of building community safety infrastructures within cities, broader than law enforcement, that will allow and create the fertile ground within which law enforcement agencies can better comply with the law.
Thank you so much for that, Tahir. What you said about the role that our work plays within communities that have experienced these harms before we got there and that will be rebuilding after we're gone is so important to me. We are there at a moment in time to do some important work through a legal process, but we don't live there. And really, our hope is that we can empower communities to be able to sustain constitutional policing over the long haul. And thinking about this moment in time, I'm thinking about you, Chief Harrison. You have served as the superintendent of the New Orleans Police Department while it was under a consent decree. And then you served as the commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department while it was under a consent decree. You have the rare treat of having been a police chief under consent decrees twice. I wonder if you could talk about that and talk about what you saw out of this program that you think we need to continue doing.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm so honored to be here, see so many people I've worked closely with, known to love and work closely with. They have changed culture. In the two departments where I worked, it would not have been possible. Best chief, best intentions, it would not have been possible because the cultures were just so tarnished. And I believe DOJ called New Orleans the most troubled department in America in its findings. And having spent 9 of my 25 years there in internal affairs at 3 ranks, I was the one who could say that that was true. Even when the chief and others would say it wasn't, I was the one who could honestly say it was true. It changed culture, and I think internally, the focus of 5 areas that I think are important that everything fits into are policy, training, supervision, management, and discipline. The focus on those areas, now in management, technology, wellness, everything falls under management there, but the focus on those 5 areas has caused the culture to change. And like Mr. Perez said earlier, it changed, and they're not mutually exclusive. They work hand in hand. Reform and public safety work hand in hand, and we have now, with the help of DOJ, been able to debunk this myth that you can't reform while providing public safety. You can't reform while preventing crime and reducing crime. It has been done in both places where I work and in other places, and there are people in the room who are witness to that right now. And so it has changed culture because there are so many things that either are barred by union agreements, or in the case of New Orleans where it wasn't a collective bargaining, it was such a strong culture that we were unable to overcome change because of that. And these consent decrees, the pattern and practice investigation and consent decrees, with the focus on policy, training, supervision, management, and discipline, has allowed us and others to overcome cultures that were just steeped in cronyism, nepotism, and all of the poor ways of selection, hiring, and promotion, all of the things that put us into these bad situations. Secondly, having police be all things to all people, separating that out, and then forcing cities to build infrastructure to handle the things that police were asked to do but never was supposed to do, and then holding cities accountable. So it's not just the chief answering to a consent decree, but it's also the cities, counties, having to put in and build infrastructure to relieve the burden of the police handling all of the things that we were never supposed to handle. And as it's already been mentioned, most of that put us in consent decrees. But now making cities co-responsible. And then lastly, making communities co-authors and co-creators of policy and co-creators of training and co-developers of what we want the culture to be. And I'll end by saying, consent decrees allowed us to either build relationships that were never built, improve good relationships, and repair broken relationships.
Well, thank you so much. I always find what you say about this work so inspiring because I think you see where many people, many leaders in your position see only opposition, you see opportunity, and have really been able to work with those opportunities, invest in them, and make some real changes in the departments while you were a leader there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Attorney General Keith Ellison.
Hey.
We are so glad that you are here. You have had a very unique perspective on watching our program. You've served in the Minnesota House of Representatives for a couple of terms. You served in Congress for 6 terms. Thank you for your service.
Right down the street.
Right down the street. Yeah. And now you are the 30th Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. Relevant to what we're talking about today, you brought charges against Derek Chauvin in 2020. And a jury convicted him of those charges a year later. You have been seeing the impact of criminal cases on this kind of work, and you've seen the impact of this sort of broader look that we do through this program. And I wonder if you could talk about what you've seen that we do through this program that you think we need to continue doing.
Well, let me tell you, after the jury rendered the verdict in the Chauvin case and he was found guilty, one of the things that I said is, this is accountability, but it's not justice. In order to have justice, you're going to have a pattern and practice change. And that pattern and practice change very likely needs to be backed up by a pattern and practice potential lawsuit. And so and I think Tom said it before, he prosecuted an officer who violated somebody's rights before Rodney King. That action didn't change LAPD, but it was the pattern and practice that brought that systemic change about. Same thing in Minneapolis. That's what we're seeing right now. And we're very proud of the new chief we have. We're proud of the chief we had when George Floyd was killed. The chief actually, both times, has been operating very well. But the presence of the federal government and the state government allows that chief to be able to say, you guys, we've got to make these changes, because there's a lot of pushback, and I'm sure the chief knows about the pushback, and the pushback is powerful, and those guys are going to be around a long time, and they're not going to stop, and they will slowly try to erode the changes. Now, I'm not talking about all officers. In fact, I believe most officers really do want these changes. They swear an oath to that badge, and they believe in it, but not everybody does. And sometimes the folks who don't want to protect public safety, they're going to be around too. And so there's this tug and pull around who's going to control the department. The people who are dedicated to public service, or the people dedicated only to themselves and their crew. And so that really is what we've seen in Minneapolis, is can the people who want to do public safety get control of the department? And I could get specific, and if you ask me to, I will, but that really is the dynamic that we see playing out. And I'll just say this. One of the most important things about the patterns and practice statute that the DOJ enforces is that it continued to exist. I will say, and I hope I'm not out of place as an invited guest here, that it was not good for police community relations when AG Sessions didn't enforce those consent decrees. That was not a good thing. I'm sorry for being so blunt. I mean, the good news is I'm going to be leaving in about 20 minutes. But I will say that it is important, no matter what your political views may be, to understand that if you have chronic, horrible relations between police and community, you are going to have a riot. You're just going to have one. It's just going to happen. You're going to pay out lots of money in police brutality lawsuits. You're going to see an increase in crime, because people who commit crimes know when police and community have a horrible relationship, and that's a good place to sell dope or do whatever bad thing you want to do. And so what I'm saying is that your existence and your persistent existence is very important, and it doesn't matter if you're very conservative or very liberal. It is important that there be some force that has the authority to impose its will to say, we're going to operate constitutionally, legally, and we're going to allow those police-community relations to really bond and be strong for the sake of all. And so I hope I hope they exist into the future. and that is my prayer.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I'm thinking about the future of this program, and that our program exists within a larger context of law enforcement and public safety. And public safety and law enforcement are evolving all the time. And our program needs to evolve along with it. One of the biggest evolutions that we've seen in recent years is in the area of alternative response. The idea, and I don't even know if that's the right name anymore, but it's the idea that there are some 911 calls that don't need a police response. There may be somebody else who'd be better suited for it. We've seen this popping up in cities across the country. And so my question, I want to start with you, Chief Harrison. When you think about those programs that are now coming up, and what do you think is the role of this pattern or practice work as this evolution is taking place?
Well, thank you. I think my answer is similar to and connected to the first answer. Police have been asked to be all things to all people. And so we were out there, to a large degree, many still are answering calls for behavioral health, answering calls for homelessness, answering calls to deal with issues that are addiction that may not be crimes, but they're calls nonetheless. And many times when we get there, the only thing available to the officer is enforcement. And when that happens, that has caused us to violate rights, that has caused us to make arrests when we should have been doing something totally different, or perhaps someone more suited to handle the call should have been dispatched. Cities don't have the infrastructure, and so where we go from here, we're all forced to do more with less. Departments are shrinking, fewer people have an interest in the profession, people are leaving and fewer people are coming, so we have to be smart. We call it smart policing or advanced policing. Some call it alternative response, where cities have to build the infrastructure to handle homelessness and behavioral health and all the other things that professionals are supposed to handle, police are not supposed to handle unless it's crime related or violence involved or the threat of a weapon. And so as cities do that, and as consent decrees compel cities to do that, because many won't unless they're compelled to do it, because it's a funding issue. It's all in how you think about it politically. And so I think the future of this program is to stay the course, make sure cities are included, so the burden is not just on police, because the root cause of the police misaction is usually something not police related. But it's a police action or misaction or bad action that causes police departments to get themselves into trouble that consent decrees now have to help us get out of. And I think the future is making sure that cities understand the importance of the alternative response or the smart policing model, which reduces the burden on the police, but now not in a way that makes cities want to reduce police. The time that we save could be built back into community engagement and all the other things that we've lost along the way because we've lost people, we've lost time. We need to build that back.
Thank you, Chief. To hear the Center for Innovations in Community Safety has been really, really active on alternative response. I think one of the most inspiring things that I've done over the last few years was go to the convening that the Center for held at Georgetown of alternative response programs from across the country, and just seeing the diversity of programs that are out there. So I wonder if you could address this question about, what do you see, where do you see these programs going, and where do you see a program like ours fitting in?
Sure. So I see this as one of the most important innovations that's happening in municipalities across the country. 1 in 5 of the 1,000 plus people who are killed by police each year, at least 1 in 5, are in the midst of a mental health crisis. Now, I mentioned earlier, it's not just about the killings. The killings are awful in and of themselves, but there are millions of 911 calls each year in which there is really, the problem is a health problem, right? If you were having a stroke and you called 911, we wouldn't send the police. We used to, actually. And then we invented ambulances, and we said police aren't necessarily the best sole responder in that sort of a situation. And across the country, a lot of cities are starting to say, first, they're recognizing that, as the chief said, we don't necessarily have this infrastructure, so we have to build it. And they are building it. In places like Albuquerque, I think it's no accident that Albuquerque is one of the most developed community safety programs in the country. The head of their community safety department sits right alongside the chief of police. The chief of the fire department has the direct ear of the mayor. Just opened up a brick and mortar independent building. And I think it's no accident that Albuquerque is coming out of a consent decree, and that's the sort of perspective that they've taken. But the downstream consequences when we don't respond to folks with the response that they actually need in that moment are awful, not only for our communities, where we send people further and further into crisis without getting the care that they need, but as the chief said, it's bad for law enforcement as well. We've got across the country law enforcement agencies struggling to hit their numbers in terms of in terms of staffing, right? And so if don't have enough people and we're sending them to do things that don't need to be done by law enforcement, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And it makes law enforcement's job a whole lot more difficult while having negative downstream consequences for the people who live in our cities. Cities are showing us that this is possible, right? And I think one of the things that really excites me about the work that DOJ is doing in this space is in recognition of the incredible work happening in Albuquerque and Durham and Atlanta and fledgling programs in Seattle and Cincinnati and Trenton, that the tens of thousands of calls that these programs that are still very small by comparison to law enforcement, but the tens of thousands of calls that these programs are taking are showing us that an appropriate response is a reasonable thing for residents to be asking for, right? It's not something where we only have one choice. We only have, I love what my friend Barry Friedman at NYU Law says, that people call 911, they don't necessarily call the police, we send the police to these sorts of situations, that we can make the choice to send someone else. And that choice to send someone else makes it easier for law enforcement to engage in constitutional and law and comply with the law. And it means that within our cities, our community safety infrastructure is starting to look more broad, more comprehensive, and like something that can lead us to a place where our cities are actually caring for the people who need the care, who need care in the first place.
Thank you so much to hear. Yeah, you can clap for that. I agree. And you know what you said about the staffing challenges that you see in police departments across the country, and these programs are coming along at a time when there is a real crisis in staffing at police departments. Is you know, it's something to think about in terms of how are you going to meet the needs that are out there. Attorney General Ellison, I wanted to get your perspective on this. That you know, you've had the experience as a policymaker and now working at the state level. And seeing what's going on in Minneapolis with these kinds of alternative responses. You know, what do you see in the future of these programs, and how does this pattern or practice work fit into you?
Well, one of the things that the pattern practice work does is it creates, or at least has a potential to create, creativity among community. So we've seen a number of things since George Floyd, since you know, the federal government showed up in this space that have that might be examples of alternative response. You know, for example, our county attorney in Ramsey County, his name is John Choi, says, you know what? If you have a air freshener on your like your rear view, we're not going to stop you for that. We'll send you a ticket. You went through an intersection. We know who you are. We'll send you a ticket. If we do need to stop you to tell your lights out, we're going to give you a warning and even give you a voucher to maybe get it fixed if you can't afford it. But we're going to stop people when there's a safety problem. You're speeding. You're doing something that's going to hurt somebody. Then we're going to stop you. But just some of these non-dangerous stops, we're not going to do that. And you know what? They have found just as much contraband, stopped just as many people doing wrong things, and have lowered sort of the opportunity for bad interaction between police and motorists all at the same time. It's kind of miraculous. The other thing is that in Minneapolis, we have a group called Canopy. This is a community-led group that started on its own, but then now contracts with the city to do interventions for people who have mental health, who are in mental health crisis. So as you're absolutely right, Professor and Chief, a lot of people, a high percentage, are in a mental health crisis, get a police call, the police get a call, and they show up and do what they know how to do, and that's often use force. And so Canopy doesn't work instead of the police, it works with the police, and a lot of times, if you need the police there, they can be there, but a lot of times police will say, you guys got this, we'll see you later. And I've gone on ride-alongs with them quite a bit, and I'm actually really impressed with how they help calm the situation. And one of the things we learned is that if you are in a autistic meltdown, you might demonstrate behaviors that a police officer is trained to recognize as aggressive. And so what happens then? The officer feels like they're targeted by aggression, they react with aggression, and next thing you know, some autistic person's gotten killed. So the thing is, this has been a really good thing. But then there's more than that. If I have the time, I'll just tell you a very quick story. There is a corner in Minneapolis called Lindale and Broadway. You know where it is. In this corner, there was a gas station, and the gas station's nickname was the murder station. I would tell my wife, honey, please do not get gas up there, because bullets don't have names on them. Don't. And then there was a liquor store that was like just as bad. And if you were looking to buy drugs or do whatever crazy thing you want to do, that was a good place to do it. Police wanted to prevent crime, and because the neighborhood was definitely complaining. And I thought to myself, you know what? Sooner or later, some kid who didn't do anything is going to get killed on that corner by a police officer. But what community did through churches, through a group called A Mother's Love, and others came together. They called us, they called the police. The police set up monitoring, and I served both gas station and the liquor store with a notice of nuisance and said, we're gonna seek an injunction to shut you down unless things change quick. Within 30 days, we went from this being a crime-ridden area to basically a pretty quiet area which hasn't had any critical incidents in like a year and a half. And this is because we didn't just roll up in there and start nightsticking people, This area could have been, this was on the north side of Minneapolis. George Floyd could have easily been killed in an environment like this. One of the things I noticed is that a lot of times when you have a tragic police incident, deadly force incident, it is precipitated by community outrage around crime. Notice how when Tyree Nichols was killed by the Scorpion unit, their justification for the aggressive policing was that this is a tough area. And in George Floyd, it was like, this is a Bloods area. And oftentimes that does precede. So having community engagement, trusting police, working together can reduce the crime, prevent a critical incident, deadly force incident, and bring about a whole lot of other examples. So those are just a few examples how the pattern and practice presence helped community come up with its own solutions. And I think there's a lot more that can be done in this area. And I look forward to more of it, which is why I hope it lasts.
Well, I want to thank you all again. I hope that everyone here shares this sentiment that hearing leaders like you It's just a reminder that we have solutions.
We got them.
We have solutions. And it's inspiring to know that there's people out there working on them. So thank you all.
Good job. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you for your insights and for being with us today. I'm delighted now to turn it over to our final speaker, Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Kristen Clark, for closing remarks.
What a great program. I just want to thank all of you for being a part of this really urgent conversation and close with some observations based on what we heard from our speakers today. One, this work is about principles that lie at the heart of our democracy. It is about constitutional policing and safeguarding people's basic and fundamental civil and constitutional rights. It's about the right to be free from excessive use of force, free from unreasonable searches and seizures. It's about freedom of speech. And it is about ensuring that our government doesn't treat you differently because of your race or your ethnicity or your disability. We've also heard today that we've got to approach this work with the urgency that it demands. Unlawful policing undercuts the work of law-abiding officers and takes a real toll on communities. And all too often the consequences are tragic. And Tamika Palmer reminds us about that every single moment of every day. Three, that we've got to acknowledge that some police departments are not waiting. In many cases, there are police departments that are being proactive and taking steps that are modeled off of the reforms set forth by our consent decrees. We need more of that. We are not going to litigate our way out of this crisis or litigate our way towards police reform. So I want to acknowledge the police departments out there doing the right thing. There are police officers who embrace this work, right? There are police officers who welcome reform. They want policies and training that equip them to minimize violence. They want clear rules for what they can and can't do. They want practical strategies that they can use on the street. They want stronger supervision and accountability. 5, consent decrees are not forever. Right, at some point we put the baton back into the hands of cities and communities. And in fact, we are doing that today as we end a settlement agreement with the city of Yonkers, New York, and the Yonkers Police Department because they have successfully implemented all of the reforms called for by our agreement. And we saw crime there drop substantially during the 2017 to 2023 lifeline of our agreement. Consent decrees are successful, impactful, and transformative. You heard about some of those success stories today. I just want to remind all of you that it's not just about reducing use of force. Our 12601 work, for example, has had a dramatic impact in Ferguson, Missouri, where officials have revised their court policies and procedures to eliminate the profit incentives underlying its exploitative policing practices. The city reduced its charges. The city reduced its charges from $21,000 per year before our investigation to 5,000 cases per year in the 3 years after it entered a consent decree. And in Baltimore, the police department has reduced its arrests for certain nonviolent misdemeanor offenses. And the city has stepped up its investment in violence prevention, a significant shift from the era of zero-tolerance policing and clearing corners strategy that we encountered when we first got there. And then finally, policing reform and public safety go hand in hand, a point that Tom Perez made earlier. Newark, New Jersey, and I know we've got folks from Newark here, for example, violent crime fell about 40% from 2016 when the consent decree took effect. 40% drop between 2016 and 2022. And in Baltimore, crime decreased 13% between April 23 and April 2024, including a 20% drop in violent crime. So let's take all of these lessons that we have heard today and get to work and roll up our sleeves. This work is incredibly important. I want to acknowledge all of the community organizing and advocacy that goes into shining a spotlight on the communities where the need for our work and our attention is most urgent. But I also just want to thank all of you, all of the community members, the former and current Justice Department attorneys here with us, city and police officials, the independent monitors, the judges. It takes a village, and this village is one that we should all be incredibly proud of. We've done a whole lot of work over the past 30 years, but we've still got a lot of work to do in the road ahead. Thank you so much for being here and being a part of this conversation today. And allow me, if you will, to give the last word to Tamika Palmer.
Excuse me. I really just want to say thank you all for all the work you have done and will continue to do. I hope you realize how important it is to families like mine. I only pray that places like Louisville can look to places like Seattle and so many others and understand how important the consent decrees are. And it's not there to hurt them. It's simply to bridge the gap in our communities. And I am just honored to be here. I am just eternally grateful to you all doing the work, and pray that we continue to stay the course because we have a long journey ahead of us and so much more work to do. So I just simply thank you all.